Blessings, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Today I wanted to talk about wholeness through curiosity. How when we can adopt that childlike wonder about our experience and begin to whole ourselves, to humanize each and every part of us as a part of us that is worthy of at least being curious about the feeling and the need underneath of our actions and feelings and thoughts. And it is in that willingness to be curious that we can really begin to hold these parts of us that we may not agree with how they're showing up, those survivor selves, the shadow, the darkness. But we can invite that part of us to be known and to be understood. So connecting with an aspect of us, whether it's an unhealthy habit or a survivor self that we adopt, like intelligence or knowing or planning or control. I mean, survivor self can show up in infinite myriad of ways, right? Like any sort of personality trait that we might consider good or even bad in our culture is probably stemming from a survivor self. And a survivor self is simply, we come into the world as a healthy self, whole, complete, connected to Creator, and then something happens, a wound happens when we feel disconnected from Creator, disconnected from our authenticity, from our power. And it doesn't matter what that trauma looks like on the outside. It's very dependent upon the sensitivity of the individual and how they internalize that moment. And so it can be something very mundane on the outside, but internalized as a trauma. And so this wound happens and it creates a wounded self. And so the survivor self comes to protect that wound, to wrap around that wound. So the survivor self can be, emotional intelligence, or could look like hyper-awareness of your environment, or whatever ways that we protected that wound as a child, right? We became intelligent, or we became self-sufficient or independent. We expressed our boundaries or chose to not express our boundaries. All of these moments that we made these decisions as a young child that are now dictating how we exist in the world. And so these parts of us, the survivor self parts, are worthy of love, right? They are worthy of being seen and honored because they've kept us alive for this long. So we want to first start by honoring the survivor selves, honoring these parts of us that were rejected or didn't receive their needs and feelings acknowledged and met when they were a child, right? This unmet need, this trigger, whatever you're experiencing, the trigger is a gateway to this unmet need of the wounded self. But first we have to approach the survivor self. We have to approach the wounded self and the survivor self. We step into our power, into the healthy self. We resource ourselves through breath, through connecting in nature, through prayer, through intention. Then we step in once we feel resourced and energized. Okay, what is the feeling that I'm feeling right now? Let me sit with that feeling inside of my body. Where does it show up in my body? And start to name the somatic experience. So what is the texture? What is the shape? What is the color? Does it have a beginning and an end? Is it still or is it moving? Does it have edges, right? So defining those things in your felt sense of that trigger. And generally when that comes up, the survivor self will be the one that comes online because the survivor self has been protecting that inner child for decades, right? If not since you were in the womb, right? Survivor self could even be the trauma that you experienced in the womb of your mother. And so we bring once the survivor self is seen, then we hold it and we thank it. We say, thank you for your service. Thank you for protecting this inner child for so long. I'm so grateful that you were there to keep me alive. You can rest now. Then we go to the wound underneath, right? So once the survivor self feels safe, it feels like that inner child, that inner wound is going to be taken care of, then the survivor self does release. That's when we have those moments of stepping into our healthy self. So once the survivor self surrenders, then we can approach the wound, we can approach the inner child. And we could recognize that the survivor self, even though that's the one driving the bus 90% of the time, that underneath of that survivor self, out of that personality trait that we have, is a wounded child that has valid feelings and valid needs. And so to be willing to go to that part of us, to the wound, and ask, what are you feeling? And allow that child full authenticity, full expression of whatever it is that wound is, right? Maybe it's a need to be seen, or maybe it's a need to have peace and safety, or maybe it's a need for connection. Whatever the need underneath, acknowledging it, because it's inarguable, right? So first, feeling the feelings of that wounded self, feeling the feelings of the inner child, allowing them to be seen, and then asking, what is it that you need? What can I do for you? And one thing, depending on what your love languages are, if you've heard of the 5 love languages, I highly recommend looking into it. It's very simple. It's basically like how you like to give and receive love. And in this system, they use 5 different types. So the ways of giving and receiving love are words of affirmation, acts of service, so cooking, cleaning, the things the nice things that we do for people. Then gifts, giving gifts, physical touch, and then quality time, so time spent together. And so depending on our love languages, our inner child might have corresponding love languages. But to make space, right? If that child just needs to be seen and needs to be heard, then you can do the acts of service and just listen, have that quality time with that inner child. Or maybe the child needs words of affirmation, wants advice, wants encouragement, or a little pep talk. You could do that, right? But to really go and feel, I think, is the first step, and then asking, how do I fulfill the need of this child? And then how do I fulfill this need and scale it into my life? So if I recognize and ask and go to this child, and let's say this child is feeling angry because this inner child, this inner wound, needs safety, and it's needed safety for a long, long time. Well, once we go to the inner child, then we can ask it, okay, how does it feel? How does that